Hi.
Hey there, how are you?
Hi. Oh God, you're too loud. I gotta turn you down.
The recording's going. Shall we pause that?
Yes, I was just thinking the same thing. There you are.
Welcome, everyone, to the California Library Association ongoing series, the Ursula Meyer Advocacy Fund Training Program. As you probably know, we do these once a month. We've got a brief slide up here that we're going to leave up for about 30 seconds for anybody watching the archive version so they know what's going on, and then we're going to jump right into today's topic. So you have not lost audio. You just get a few seconds to read this. Okay, and that concludes the speed reading portion of our program. Now we're going to jump into live stuff and have some fun here. As we look at podcasting, that combination of podcasting, advocacy, and libraries, there's a lot for us to consider, not only the ins and outs of podcasting, which is why we've got the panel together today that we've got going, but also what goes into bringing together the people that will actually be able to help you in your advocacy efforts. When I think of advocacy and how people kind of stumble into podcasting as an aspect of advocacy, I think of D. Ray McKesson, who some of you might recognize as being that person who was a Minneapolis educator back in 2014. When he saw what was going on with the shooting of Michael Brown, he decided he had a higher calling in life, at least temporarily. He got on a bus and he went to Ferguson so he could see firsthand what was going on. And he changed overnight virtually from being an educator in a formal sense to being an educator using Twitter to report from on site what was happening there. He got a lot of notoriety for that. He got a lot of compliments. He also got a lot of grief, as people do get when they do controversial things. And that's part of advocacy that we're all familiar with and that we have to work with. What he did off of that is realize he had a voice that was worth hearing and he had a constituency that was worth developing. So he did a variety of things, and around 2017 actually moved into a podcast series, which is still running. I believe it's got about 250 episodes out. The series is called Pod Save the People, and reading from the description of it, it explores news, culture, social justice, and politics with a couple of his colleagues. He and his colleagues offer a unique take on the news with a special focus on overlooked themes, stories, topics that impact people of color, and give us a lot of insight into things we might not normally think about. And that leads us to what we're talking about today. A podcast does not have to be something where you sit down for months or years and you plan it all out and you figure out who your first 10 speakers are going to be. Sometimes, as Maurice is I'm sure, going to tell you when we get to the part of how he got into doing podcasts, sometimes it's a labor of love that coincides with what you are really interested in advocating for. In Maurice's case, I've known him for years, been on his podcast for many, many years. And the underlying advocacy that goes on there is advocacy for better learning in libraries and the communities they serve. Steve Thomas, who is also with us today, has an entirely different kind of podcast, Circulating Ideas, which focuses more on one-on-one interviews. But again, there's an underlying sense of activism in his choice of people that he has in, the kind of questions that he has there, and how he interacts with his community through that podcast. So as we look at this today, this is certainly not a lecture. We're going to start off with some basic introductory kind of stuff, but we want you to be involved with us in a conversation about what needs you have in your advocacy efforts that can be best served by adding podcasting in or some variation on podcasting. And by the end of the session, we want to have workshopped a few things with you so you walk out with some sort of an action plan. So having said all that, Maurice, let me throw this over to you with the basic introductory question. When you think of podcasting and advocacy, what experience do you bring to this that you want to share with people right up front to get the juices flowing?
I think podcasting is all about storytelling. Very importantly, it's telling your story. Podcasts help you tell your story. Podcasts help you share your story. Libraries are a very tough advocacy sell for this reason. A lot of salaries go towards human bodies and people. You can't get in someone's head and say, okay, this person has an MLS that took this much experience. This person then has 20 years of experience that we've paid all this money for. Here's the value they bring to the community every day. There's some of that with numbers, but stories really sell advocacy. How did you help this person? What were you able to create in your community? And podcasts are a quick-ish way of A, capturing that, and B, sharing it. Most people already have a website. You already have a place to at least put up an audio file for people. You don't have to have a separate podcast thing. if you just want to have an audio file on your library website, do that. It's really a very easy way to help tell your library story. You can share stories about your staff, you can share stories about the people that you serve, you can share stories about your community that maybe people don't know. There are a bunch of different ways to do it, number one. And number two, there are folks who do, Paul, plan out their first 10 podcasts because that's the way their library works. They want that type of plan. Others, like me, can literally do it by the seat of their pants. And I've been doing it by the seat of my pants since 2008. So I've had some help with my pants with suspenders like Paul, who's a wonderful support person, and Jill Hurst-Wall, who also supports the work of TSA training, but they got dragooned into it. So, it helps to have a good network for that. It also helps to not be scared by telling a story. Podcasting is very easy to get into. We'll talk some about equipment and whatnot later, but it's really you can do it with your phone and about a couple of hours of engagement.
Maurice, can you think of something that's happened on the podcast over these 11 or 12 years that has shown the power of that podcast to actually influence people in a positive way?
Oy. There are times when we've done learning, I think especially around the pandemic, where we were helping people understand that they weren't alone in the flipping that had to happen. I think that was very important. That we, as Paul mentioned, the show is really a resource for people who are generally in libraries, specifically in training and learning roles in libraries, but also management roles, etc. And we helped bridge the, oh my gosh, what are we going to do now of the pandemic, how people had to change what we did, et cetera, how to rethink things. Many of the folks on TSA training had been doing virtual learning for years, and we're able to share our experiences for those who suddenly got thrown into the deep end of the pool. And we're able to be the life jacket, life raft, the little tiny circle of inflated air that people hold on to in a pool. We were that for them, that they were able to say, okay, it is scary, but it's doable. And I think that's the role, at least the pandemic at TSA training has played. I've had folks tell me that they were exposed to other people and resources that help them through TSA training. So it is a networking opportunity. We bring people on the show who are brilliant people, and we give people a minute into their brain, and then they could connect with them and create a deeper connection.
On the theme of bringing people together, I want to note that one of the people in our workshop today that's here as an audience member is Tula Domini, who was a colleague of mine from Shaping EDU at Arizona State University. We've been documenting pandemic era learning successes. Maurice interviewed Tula on TS for Training not too long ago as a way of spreading the word that this is a global effort that comes through a podcast like that, connects people for the hour-long time that we spend together every couple of weeks, and then takes on an extra life through the archive versions where people can go back and listen to them. So that set as groundwork. Steve, let's talk about the way that you approach circulating ideas, how you got into it, and something that talks about the advocacy aspect of what you do through your interviews.
Sure. And on that same note of what you were just talking about with Tula, Julie Ann Winkelstein is also on the call, and she's been a guest on my podcast. So a couple of people there. And so I've been doing the podcast, and I also owe Julie an email. I'll email you, I promise, Julie. I've been doing the podcasts since 2011, so for a really long time. And the reason I got into it was one of the reasons I think that's still kind of a valuable advocacy thing, just in a professional development sense, is that it's connecting people to other people and a diverse group of voices in the profession. And I started it basically, and I still continue to do it in the way I choose it is what interests me. And so, but I do try to also make it wide ranging. So, mostly, obviously, I mean, I work at a public library. What I want to hear about is what helps public libraries, but I make an effort to have academic librarians on, school librarians on, people from all over the spectrum talking about all kinds of different topics. Even Paul and Maurice, I would not have met if not for the podcast. And because I've gone to conferences that I wouldn't have gone to, I've met all kinds of people I never thought I would talk to. I got to talk with even cool authors like Cory Doctorow that I never would have gotten to talk to before. And I also, one of the things that I think is, I've been told is a good, powerful part of it, which is still in professional development land, is almost every episode I have, or almost every year, all but one, I've had the candidates for the American Library Association president on to talk about what they want to bring to the role. And I've heard from several people that that's been valuable to them and helping them figure out who they want to vote for. So it's just another outlet for them to get their message out and kind of figure out the differentiation between various candidates. And then the other side of it is that's kind of from circulating ideas, but then I took my podcasting experience and brought it to my day job at the library. And I now do 2 podcasts at my work. So I do lots of podcasts. One of them is like an author interview thing. So it's kind of your typical, just talking to an author about their book and a little bit there. That's good to spread that part of the library's message of literacy and talking with authors and what's great about libraries. But then we also do another podcast, which is we call Flip the Library, which is about how to get the library's message out there, to telling those stories that Maurice was talking about. What is it that the library is doing for the community? One of the things that I always like to say to people who come into the library is that this is your library. It's the public library. You've already paid for it. Like, it's not even that because I don't really like the free thing that we say, because it's not free, it's prepaid. Like, we've calculated it around here, $40 of your property tax payment every year goes to the library. Number one, that's only $40. That's not very much. And number two, you already paid it when you paid your property tax. So this is all your stuff. Everything we're doing here is for you. So getting that out there, that what we do for the community, which is not just books, but books are an important part of it, but we also offer programs. We have a program for people coming out of incarceration, of how to start their own small business. We have a new library. It'll be opening up in a couple of years. They just did the groundbreaking on it. That's going to be, half of it is the new library, and the other half is using a building that used to be the African-American school in this county back in the 50s and 60s, where all the Black kids had to go to school. And they were going to tear that building down, but a group of alumni got together and saved the building. And so they're going to make it into a museum, basically. So half of it will be a museum and half of it will be a library. And so they get to preserve that story, and it's going to be all about the African-American experience in our county, in our area, and it'll be a great thing, and the library gets to be a part of that. So that's fantastic too. And we had them on the podcast recently too, to get that message out there of what this is going to be. So that's another powerful thing that the library can do, just get the message out with these partnerships that we do throughout the community, because the library can't do everything on our own, but we can partner up with these other people and make the magic happen.
See, thank you for punctuating that. My next question was going to be the one you just finished answering, which is, can you tie the podcast back to that particular initiative to save that building? The answer clearly is yes. So as we look at this from our advocacy point of view, and we think about, why am I thinking about podcasts? You've just heard Steve talk about how he integrates the podcast into the issues that are going on in his community. You've heard Maurice talk about the importance of storytelling. I want to make sure that all of you watching this, either live or in the archive version, understand the series through California Library Association has been going on now for almost a year and a half. We record every episode. We put them on the California Library Association YouTube channel. So if you want more of these as learning objects and learning opportunities, go back into that channel. You'll find a couple of things we've done on storytelling. You'll find a few of the other things that Steve and Maurice have already been talking about. So we're starting here with the idea of engagement, storytelling, making it personal. I get into this because it means something to me. And that, again, is at the heart of advocacy. Let us now, as a group, in our workshop setting here, start laying the groundwork for walking away with an action plan, first of all, by identifying what we want to have in our podcast. So a question for all of you as audience members, not just the panelists here. What is it that makes you listen to a podcast that you regularly follow? Let's identify the things that make us go there and make sure we incorporate those into our work. Anybody in the call want to jump into that, either via chat or unmuting yourself and going live with this?
I can answer that a little bit. I don't listen to a lot of podcasts, but the ones I listen to are always social justice oriented and related to what Maurice said about storytelling. I like to hear from the real people doing the real work or having with the lived experience. That's what's most important to me. I don't tend to listen to a lot of experts or people who are, you know, more academic. I tend to want to listen to the real stories. So that's what is motivating me to be here today is I have an idea for something I want to do, and it would be along those lines.
Let's deviate a little from the plan and get right to the heart of that. What is the thing you're looking at wanting to do, and how can we incorporate that into what we're doing together in the 90 minutes we have here?
I teach a class. This is the sorry, I have a light flickering on. I'm gonna have to replace the light bulb at some point. It keeps flickering on and off. I teach a class right now, a library school class called usually it's called the role of libraries in addressing homelessness and poverty. This year, for the first time, it's called the role of libraries in addressing youth homelessness. And I'm focusing just on unaccompanied youth ages 12 to 24 approximately, and age up to 25. And one of the things that's really important to me in my class is to bring in people with a lived experience who are either doing the social services or the people that actually have had the lived experience of experiencing homelessness, and the related issues. Like I bring in people who work with incarcerated youth. I bring in people who work with youth with disabilities. I bring in people who work with the LGBTQ+ community of youth experiencing homelessness. So all of that. And I realized like about halfway through the semester that these are incredible people coming in, and I can't even begin to include all of the people that I want to include. I have my students watch a lot of videos from conferences, like from Point Source Youth and other places. And what I would like to do is somehow figure out a way of having a podcast that brings in these stories, but also brings in the people in libraries who are doing the work too. And there are not a lot of them, but I don't know who they are because if they don't have a library journal article written about them, nobody knows. Or if they're on Steve's show, I might know, but otherwise they're doing the work and nobody knows. So somehow I want it to be for both sides. I want people in the social services and people with the lived experience to know that libraries are interested and to talk about their work. And I want libraries to hear what amazing work is being done and think to themselves, wow, I could do that with them. And just to finish up, my students have to do an action plan. That's their big project for the semester. And they have to find a library, a partner, interview people at both, and then bring together what is needed and then create a plan. They don't have to put it in place, although over the last 5 years, some of my students have put them in place. And so that's part of it. My goal in life is to see more of that happening. And so I was thinking if I had the podcast and just what you were saying is you hear from somebody for a few minutes, or maybe Steve was, I can't remember, one of you said, you hear from somebody for a few minutes, then you later on make connections. Maybe it was you, Maurice. And that's what I really want is I want these voices out there talking to each other, and my students are just, you never know which speaker is going to strike my students, which one they're going to say, oh my gosh, I need to know more about this person. You just never know. Like yesterday I had somebody talking about tiny houses and she was amazing. And so anyway, that's my idea. And I have a lot of practical questions and also would love any suggestions about what this would look like.
Great, thank you. This makes an important point here that we haven't even scripted in, but it needs to be said here. A lot of what happens in great podcasting is what's happening right now in this workshop. You started to bring that thing up. You talked about having all these voices that you want in. Our structure today is, the first part of this is all the introductory stuff covering the basics. And the second part, we're going to talk about how to get people in and how to get the right interview subjects in. You've teed that up beautifully by saying you have all these people and you don't know how to get them in. So Steve, Maurice, hold that thought. Oh, go ahead, Maurice. Maybe you don't want to.
Julie, you're halfway there.
Yeah.
You already have the contacts. You're already doing these things for your class. It's a matter of either recording the class in an audio file or doing it separately and then putting it somewhere. That's all a podcast is. I mean, you could look, Steve is really fancy. There's opening music, closing music. He has a wonderful introduction. He's got sponsors. I don't have any of that. I'm sort of low key tech. I'm lazy. That's really what it is. But you already have, the key thing is you already have an interesting subject that's not really covered, that could use some coverage. And there's nothing to stop you with your contacts ready from creating some object that's whatever it is, youth in the library, you can come up with some fancy name for it, etc. But you already have 90% of what you need. The technology is only 10%, and you already have some of that because you already teach. That, are you doing your classes online or face to face?
No, synchronous online. So yeah.
Oh, for goddess sake, you already have the recordings. So what you can do is to start is maybe excerpts of some things you've already done with person's permission. Use those people and say, hey, I'd like to continue a conversation with you. Or do you know of anyone that would be really good for my students and the public to know, who are working with youth, homelessness, eliminating recidivism, all these other things. Also the jail, people who do the prison librarians, there's a whole prison librarian association that you could easily reach out to, that would be a wonderful guests for your show, because they're there with the people who are incarcerated and they help them not to come back. Really, they want to get them out and keep them out. So you already have a podcast, you have the idea, you have 90% of it. It's probably for you finding the time to do it, which makes sense. That's usually what it is. But really, you have the beginnings of a great thing. And you can contact also the state librarian, and the various state agencies. Usually someone in there knows about those particular things that you're working on. So there's, maybe something like Topeka, Shawnee, a very big library system in the middle of the country. They may or may not have a program that does that. They could put you in touch with them. There's all sorts of ways. Everyone's like, the library is a service industry. We're here to serve whoever the public is in front of us, whether that's a colleague, whether that's a person coming off the street, doesn't matter to us. So most people are receptive to questions, and most people are generous with their time and say, why don't you contact this person? Why don't you contact this person? Oh, they'd be great for your podcast. This person would be really good. Oh, wait, here's an idea for this. So you're 90% there.
Well, and I was going to jump in and say that I agree that the word of mouth is really important, because it came up when Julie was talking that one of the very big weaknesses libraries have is marketing, and we're not very good at getting the word out. So that number one, that's what podcasting can be, can help get the word out about libraries. But it does make it hard to find those people, like you said, that don't have a library journal. They're not a mover and shaker, or they're not in the news, or they don't have a marketing department to put out press releases. So there are people doing all this work, but if there's nobody pushing a story about them for you to find, especially, locally, you might be able to find some people, but it's hard. Even with, yeah, go ahead.
Julianne, where do you work?
I was a public librarian for 20 years, and now I just teach. I teach, so I'm self-employed.
I can tell you, I know Sacramento Public deals with a lot of age of folks who are using their library who are not necessarily housed. So that's a good resource. A lot of large urban and suburban libraries have to deal with that issue. Right. So you could really just and get yourself on just the California state mailing list. I'm sure there's a mailing list that goes out to all public library folks. Say, do you know anyone doing this? I'm interested in interviewing you for a podcast to get the word out about what you do.
Yeah, I mean, I do that somewhat. It's just, yeah. I mean, to me, part of it is libraries. Libraries are, to me, libraries are very self-centered in a lot of ways. And so I'm trying to kind of break that and make them realize that maybe they could do something with some of these great people that I could bring in, and a library doesn't have to be the center of it. It's not about the library, it's about the young people and how can we all work together. And sometimes it's a small role like lending a room, and sometimes it's bigger. So yeah, but thank you.
But Julie, you also have to remember, from the library's point of view, I got to get money. So I have to show impact. So it's a both thing. Yes, it's what these people can do, but it's also what's the library's role in doing it. Right. And that's also very important, because when it comes to millage or anything else, all communities want to know is, what have you done for the community?
Yeah, that's the catch though, right? Like, so I mean, serving people who are unhoused is not something the community necessarily wants to hear about or support.
Right. But you can also say, what we're trying to do is help these people find housing. We're trying to make sure that they can find jobs. Part of what the library does is moving people from a place of being unhoused to a place where they can find some sort of semi-permanent living situation. They can get a steady job, There are a lot of libraries that now have social workers in them who help people get the services they need, because they've unfortunately become they've not unfortunately become, they are the social, they're the centers of the community. And it's what the community needs, we need to provide, because that's what we do as service folk. We
Yeah.
meet the community at their point of need. This is how we do it. And your podcast can easily help people focus on very, very specific targeted areas that there's not a lot of literature around.
Well, and I think you spin it through that positive lens of
Yep.
this is the difference that the library has made in this person's life. They you know,
Yep.
they were
Yep.
in this situation, the library intervened or did
Yep.
something, and now look at how much better their life is.
Yep.
So it's sort of that, you know, what did the library do to help out their life?
And building on you, Steve, for the $40 you've already paid. Like literally for the 40, you've already paid the $40. We did this already, and we're making people more productive in our community, however way you want to spin that. But
And maybe even these tools are available to you too.
right.
I
Yep.
mean, you know,
Yep.
So let's debrief what's happening here already in this very fast moving workshop session. We started talking about podcasting. Julianne gave us a perfect case study, which anticipates the second of the three segments here. We're going to talk about how do you get those voices in. She's ahead of the game. She's already got those voices and she knows how to reach out to them. And she said Steve and Maurice kind of counseling her on that a little bit and encouraging her. Also, we have Tula here today, who I've mentioned earlier is with that Shaping EDU project we're doing. We're documenting things. I was going to make the point later, but fair game to make it now, that what we're doing there is recording. Maurice knows this because I've interviewed him for that same series. We do hour-long interviews. We edit them down to 5 or 10 minutes, post them on YouTube as learning resources. We do not call it a podcast, but in essence, it's what a podcast does. You're getting information out there, you're sharing it with people, you're encouraging people to act on behalf of what's being advocated there. And it occurs to me as I'm saying this, that this workshop is actually in its own way sort of becoming a podcast where we've got some structure to it. But at the same time, it's a live conversation exploring real issues about advocacy, how advocates are using it to their benefit, and how people like Julianne want to get better at doing that. So we get together with something like this with a basic agenda, as you would do in a podcast. You kind of go with the flow with whatever comes up from the person you're interviewing or the panel discussion you have, as Maurice so often does. You build on that, you make connections, and at the end of it, the real action happens with what do you do after this session ends? And our goal here again today is for all of you on the live version, as well as those of you watching the archive version, is to watch. And we hope you'll have an aha moment that says, I could do that. And I could do that in an effective way that promotes toward positive results, the advocacy issue that I'm pursuing. So we've laid some great groundwork here. We're starting to make connections here. And I'm sure there are other people who haven't even gotten in here in terms of joining the conversation yet, that have shared experiences that may resonate with what Julianne's saying and what Steve's saying, what Maurice is saying, and what I'm hinting at. Before we go much further in this, we had intended to do an exercise, which is describe an advocacy topic you're pursuing and how podcasting might help you. Julianne's teed up a beautiful one. So let's hold that. I'm going to ask you, Julianne, and you, Tula, to bookmark that and circle back to that in the second segment when we really talk about the interviews, how you are going to go about getting the interviews. Tula, how you went about getting the interviews for Are We There Yet? And Stephen, Maurice, anything that you've done in that area. Well, let's see if there's anybody else on this particular call, in this particular workshop, and what's turning into kind of a podcast example of a podcast. Any other things you're looking at? Again, the basic question is describe an advocacy topic you're currently pursuing and how podcasting might help you further develop the community of support you have or seeking to attract. Any takers?
This is Marty, and I'm going to say what I have been thinking about is a lot like what Julie talked about. I am mostly retired. I'm retired from full-time work at the San Francisco Public Library, where I was the ADA coordinator for public programs and services and the accessibility services manager. And a patron, I ran into one of our longtime patrons a couple of weeks ago who said, why are you doing a podcast? You need to be talking to people about how you kicked open doors for us here. And, you know, you need to be talking about libraries. And then I talked with a colleague who's at the Brooklyn Public Library who does the same kind of work, who got really excited too. And my thought is to have people from the community, people with disabilities, talking with us about what would make their lives better and what has worked and has not worked for them in their libraries. And then to talk with colleagues about possibilities, some of the things they're doing and some of the things they're thinking about. So not specifically for a library I'm working in, but for our profession. So a little bit like what you were saying, Julie.
I love that you said that, Marty, and it's nice to see you.
It's great to see you.
And I assume your colleague is Carrie.
Yes.
So and she's one of my guest speakers every year for my class.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I love that if she's considering doing a podcast, if the two of you are considering, I love that idea. I hope it happens.
Well, she got excited yesterday, so we'll
Okay.
see.
I'll reach out to her and say, yes, do it.
Well, a thing that I have always thought is important is something you talked about too, Julie, and that is most of the time when I do training, when I have done training with colleagues, if we're doing training about how to welcome people with Tourette syndrome and other tic disorders into your library, I don't talk to people or, have experts come talk to people about what that experience is. I have people with Tourette syndrome or tic disorders come and talk about their experience and about what has been good and what has not. And in evaluations of training that we have done through the years, resoundingly in the evaluations, people have said the most useful part of the training was hearing from people speaking for themselves.
Yep.
So I want to keep that going. If I dive into this, and I'm not sure I'm going to do it.
So two quick things there. Marty, meet Julie. Julie, meet Marty, because you're both aspiring podcasters.
We've
Steve
met.
and Maurice, meet Julie and Marty. Marty and Julie, meet Maurice and Steve, who can be your advisors on this. You shoot them notes. They're accessible people. And what comes out of something like this is the realization that as little or as much time as we spend together in a conversation like this or in a formal podcast, or what I'm calling here an informal podcast, things come out of it based on what you do afterwards. Those of you watching the archive version are not privy to the chat that's going on. So I'm going to read you two comments in response to what Marty just said about her proposal for a podcast. Susan said, I'll follow that podcast about how to serve folks with different abilities. And Julianne said, me too. Marty, you have your first two followers. And I bet Steve, Maurice, and I will be on listening to your first episode too. This, folks, is how it works. As advocates, we get the right people in the right physical or virtual space. We share ideas, we pop off of each other with enthusiasm, and out of that comes results.
So Marty, the good thing about the pandemic is that folks who have different abilities, et cetera, have a way of communicating easily now. So if you have simply access to Zoom for 30 minutes, you can do a Zoom room, you find someone who you want to interview and talk about, someone who has Tourette's and tic disorders. You can talk to them for a few minutes, and then you could maybe play that off of, okay, how can we help welcome these people into the library? How can we do some of the things this person suggested? There's so many different ways you could pull that. But the nice thing about the pandemic is that, again, people have learned to deal with Zoom or WebEx or Microsoft Teams, some sort of platform that you can get an audio file from. Once you have the audio file, you can run with it in Audacity. You can put things together. You can have a separate conference. The people listen to the audio file and come with suggestions. However you want to do that, but it sounds like you already have a cross-country network of people to start. And then you have, of course, your different government agencies that deal with this all the time who go, oh my goodness, I wanted to reach out to someone in libraries, but didn't know an avenue to do that. And you give them that avenue to do that. So again, a lot of podcasting, especially for advocacy, is what do I do? So far, the two of you already have a what do you do? You already have the context. The technology is what looks like a big bridge, but it's really a very small bridge. It's really a moat. It's not a river, it's a moat. So you already have a lot of access to the stuff that you need. All you need is a place to do it regularly and that folks can go eventually and find it a lot of the time.
And you heard Maurice. Thank goodness for the pandemic.
In this very, 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 very specific case, yes, because it has forced people to communicate from where they're comfortable. And
not only that, I'm going to butt in, sorry, Maurice, but there are a lot of people who absolutely can't leave their homes.
yep,
Correct.
yep.
And they have been able to participate in library programs for the first time ever.
Yep.
So yeah,
Absolutely.
they have really gotten on board with it.
Yep.
Yeah, it's a shame it takes a big thing like this to push people into action. But yeah,
Well,
and I'm glad we did
people, Steve,
embrace
it's
it.
the libraries. The libraries were forced to.
Yep.
You know, the people were already there. They're like, hey, we'd like some service. The library's like, yeah, there's not a big enough crowd for that yet.
Right.
Suddenly there was a really big crowd for that.
Yeah, now my library, we do a weekly, story time on Zoom. So now there's something available there all the time now. So
right.
Yeah.
It was Tool and I have so consistently said over the last year with our colleagues at Shaping EDU, one of the great opportunities here, and what Maurice was justifiably saying was an opportunity as well as a tragedy for us, is what's working well that we weren't doing before? What can we hang on to now as we move into a different form of existence, having been tempered by the experiences we've had? Let's wrap this part of the segment by giving Maurice and Steve one last shot at summarizing the basic things that you want people to know in terms of how do you get started. Any upfront tips you want to offer?
Steve, I've talked a lot.
Well, and I think it's interesting because I think I've got two different methods of getting started, and then I think Maurice does his show completely differently from how I do my other two. So you're going to get a couple of different options here. So when I started mine, I mean, it was just me doing it like Maurice, just grabbing what you can for free or cheap and doing what you can. So to this day, still, I use the Internet Archive for my host, basically, which is where I upload the files from. And that's where, if you're listening to the show, you're downloading it from the Internet Archive, because that's free. I use a variety of programs to edit. There's free ones like Audacity, like Maurice said. It works really well. It looks very open source. So if you're scared of open source looking things, the quality, it looks like that, but the power, it is a great powerful tool. Because things like Logic are $200, $300. So if you don't have access to that, then you want to use that kind of thing. I also have started using a new, because I've always liked to have transcripts when I can, but that's very difficult to do. But we've now gotten to the point where machine learning AI can actually do a pretty good job of a first pass of that kind of thing. So I've got a program called Descript, which actually I can dump my files into, and it will automatically transcribe them all. And then the cool thing about that program, this is not an ad, I promise, is that I can, so you have the transcript. If you edit the text of the transcript, it also edits the audio.
Oh,
so if you take out the word that comes out of the audio as well as the text. Doesn't always sound perfect, but it does a pretty darn good job. So I've been using that because that gives me the opportunity to then have like an instant transcript, because before it was kind of when I would get around to it, and I was using these other tools that were not as good, and it would do an 80% job, which takes a lot of cleanup, whereas this thing does a 95, 96, 7% positive of doing it right. So I've been using that for editing and doing the transcripts. I believe Maurice and I both use Yeti mics. Are you still on your Snowball, or you got something else?
The Snowball's for portable. I have the next one, the Yeti standy uppy one.
Yeah, that's the one I've got.
Yeah, for the for like this purpose, I have that because the base is obscenely heavy. The Snowball is not very heavy. The base of this thing is obscenely heavy when you want it to stand. So I carry the Snowball when I'm doing portable stuff, but I also have a portable recorder that's tiny. I got it from the place that the bald-headed man owns, and it's $19, and it's a very powerful little recorder that I use now, and I'm showing it in, I see if you can see it. It's a little tiny eVista recorder. It's USB powered. It charges. It holds hours of tape that you could easily transcribe the individual audio files back to your computer and open up an Audacity or whatever audio scrubber you have and convert them into something. So do for my regular podcasts, I think of it as open play. I'm here at this place at this time, this place being talked to at this time is 9 o'clock Eastern every other Thursday, except for some holidays and vacations. And we book guests, but it's always at this date at this time, which is both good and bad. Some people can reach that, some people can't. And then you schedule things to people who can't. So you can meet people where their needs are. I use a platform called TalkShoe, which has its issues. But again, as I mentioned before, I'm lazy. So I'm used to doing it that way, and I'm going to keep doing it that way, at least for now. I might switch into that archive, but that's a lot of backup and work for it.
Yeah.
There's so many. There's so
I was
many
just gonna,
ways to
I
do
just
it.
use Zoom for my recording
Right,
and stuff
and-
now. So yeah.
And Zoom does transcripts too. So if you want to just have a transcript, Zoom will have a video file and a transcript file. And there you go. You have immediate accessibility. Is it perfect? No, but it's pretty close.
It's pretty bad, actually, I think.
It for free, Julie, it's okay-ish.
Yeah, but for people with disabilities or
I-
people who need an accurate transcript, it's not okay.
It's
and
way
for-
better than it was.
Right.
They've
It's way
worked
it's
with University of Michigan with their accessibility people, and it's really in pretty good shape at this
Right.
point.
Oh, thank you, Marty. Okay.
it's
I'm
not
glad you
hard,
said it.
it's not horrible, which is
Okay.
good.
All right, good.
It has gotten way better. It used to be complete, I won't use the word because we're in a professional setting, but it wasn't very good. Now it's gotten a bit
and I should say
better.
that the Descript product I was talking about, and I did put the link in the chat. That is not free, and that's why it's good. So I did pay for that because it has saved my. I feel like it's worth the cost to me because it has saved me so much time, and
Right.
it's gotten my transcript, so it's worth it to me. But that's why it's good. It's because it's not free.
Right.
And what Steve
and-
just said about Descript, if you're looking for it and you're watching the archive version, the website is descript.com, descript.com. So that's where you'll find the information on it. Thanks, Steve.
Yeah, but so before I used to use Skype and all this stuff to connect before, but then since pandemic, yeah, I've switched to Zoom. And another nice thing about Zoom is if you're doing more the type of podcast that I do that's more edited and stuff like that, you can also Zoom will split the files. So you get a file for each speaker. So if you wanted to edit that way where you're not talking over each other, you could do that. So you get, so like on here, if you had had that setting on here, there would be 1, 2, 3, 9, 11 different files that would pop out because every single speaker gets their own audio file. I don't usually do that. I usually just use the combined because it gives you the combined file too, but you could, if there's lots of overtalk and stuff, you could do it that way and split out different tracks. And
or you leave the overtalk for the, it being
Yeah.
a real conversation type thing. And it's
correct, right.
It's whatever you want your style to be, but I think it's also important to have annotations to whatever you do.
Yeah.
So I simply have a WordPress website. The other person, Paul, if you looked at I believe in some of the notes or some such thing, Paul books the people for TS or training, but that's because I dragooned him into doing it. I simply said, look, you want it, fine. You want to know what's coming up, then you figure it out. And that was like 8 years ago. And we've been doing it about that. And the person who writes the blog, Jill Hurst Wall, I dragoon her. Maurice, why don't you put the links up? Fine. You want to do that? Then it's your job to do that. And they both have been gracious enough to do it because they get something out of it, which is getting connections, personal development, etc. Plus, it's a lot of fun. Make your podcast fun. I think that's very important. If you listen to Steve, it's a great conversation because it's fun, it's natural, it flows. And that's what I want. I love the flow of conversation between people. And it's the host's job to bring the people together and ensure that conversation flow, not dominate the conversation sometimes, but to ensure the conversation.
Well, and one of the nice things that Maurice said earlier was this is a format that's very flexible. So like you can do a show like Maurice's, you can do a show like mine, you can do NPR kind of, you can make it super edited and stuff like that. At the end of it, you're going to have an MP3 file. That's what the end of it is with podcasts. Yep. Anything that's an MP3 file can be a podcast.
Yep.
So however you want to do it, if you want to make it super edited with lots of hire professional musicians to come in and do whatever you want to do, somebody to do a really fancy introduction for you, some voiceover artist to do something. I hear that sometimes, and it's a little weird sometimes when people do that, because it's like, it's the show, and then it's just like a regular talking voice. It's like, well, why did you get the Price is Right guy to announce you? I'm not really sure.
It looks like we got a couple of participants with comments you want to make. Tula, I noticed first, and Julianne right behind him. Tula, did you want to add anything to what's being said?
Not really.
Okay.
I was just going to say thank you for descript. I think it's worth exploring. But what I would also add is that all media reconstructions act as a communal public sphere and a hub for learning. And the easier you can do it, the better. But for people in the library space, definitely a podcast is one easy way of promoting access to information and disseminating knowledge. It's convenient, it's easy to get started, and it can be highly, highly engaging. And for people wanting to build brand authority, that's just one cheap way of doing it.
Again, for
Thanks.
those of you that are on the fence on this thing, think about what Tula and I have been doing. We don't call what we do a podcast. We and our colleagues are doing a series of interviews. We have a goal of doing 28 of them all together before the end of the project. And as quickly as we can get them edited, we're putting them out there. But that's kind of a nice intermediate step. If you don't want to make a commitment of, I'm going to do this every week or every month, try something like that with a well-defined project that has an easy to find site. Publicize the heck out of it so people know it's there, and see what you learn on that first go around, and then see if it leads you somewhere, as Marty and Julianne are talking about doing, which takes us to Julianne. You had something you wanted to add in.
I actually just had a few like practical questions I'd written down in advance. So, and that helps. What you just said actually is helpful to that, Paul. But my questions was like how often, the length, and then sending questions in advance is something that when somebody interviews me and I don't know in advance what they're going to ask me, it catches me off guard. And I'm one of those people that needs time to think about something, because otherwise my mind goes all over the place and then I forget 25 things I meant to say. So do you do that? Do you send not every single question, because I know it's like a conversation, but do you send some ideas in advance of things, hard questions specific questions you're going to ask? And then how often, so those are my questions, just the practical part of it.
How often do you think that you could produce something?
I think I could probably produce something. I guess I can answer your question, but really what my concern is but maybe what Paul said is a good idea, just to have like a project and then see where it goes. Because I'm worried that I would eventually run out of people. And then what do I do? I don't know that would happen.
You are literally the person with the machete on the undiscovered island. You are not going to run out of people. I can tell you that. You're doing something that in this call, you already have a bunch of listeners who probably know people who could do stuff. I don't think you have to worry about running out of people. Okay. Simply because there's so much activity everywhere about inclusivity, diversity, DEI, justice, etc. And that comes in in all spaces. And justice is very big. You can talk about all sorts of things, incarceration, you can talk about recidivism, how different people approach it. Do you use some sort of religion in this? How do religious groups deal? There is such a wide range that you can do. I think you are severely underestimating the interest and the breadth of your topic. Okay. So, and if you run out of stuff to say, guess what? End the podcast.
Well, that's what I was going to say. So, I mean, Maurice and I both have formats where it's basically, here's the ongoing series or whatever. You can do a limited series podcast. You can say, I'm going to do 10 episodes and I'm in and I'm out and I'm done. I mean, you can plan that in advance. You could just say, I want to do an episode about this, and you have that many topics and you do those and you're done. I mean, there's nothing to say, all podcasts don't have to be infinitely running.
Right. So the other part of it that when I was thinking about this in advance was the idea, I was thinking I could also, there's so many pieces, like Maurice just talking about incarceration. I worked as a jail and prison librarian for 7 years. So it's like a big important topic to me. So, but I was thinking I could do themes, like if I did like twice a month, and then maybe that month I don't know, or alternate themes, like, because there is incarceration
So-
and, there's all these different aspects that lead into youth homelessness.
Well, you could make
Put-
it just an
put-
overarching series that this is
Right.
about teen homelessness. And you could do, I mean, you could do seasons even. You say season 1 is about this topic and season 2 is about this topic and season 3.
Right.
I mean, I just, again,
Okay.
the flexibility of the format, you got
it's up
so
to
many
you.
options.
And
Okay.
think
that
think
sounds-
of it as someone who it's the put yourself in your consumer shoes. Think about the person looking at the thing. How much would you like to sit through? How often would you want to? What I suggest for you, Julie, is don't make yourself crazy at first. You can start out with every month, and if you need to increase the frequency, then increase the frequency. Or you can start out every 2 weeks and decrease the frequency. People do it all of the time. As long as it's somewhat regular and known that you're going to do it, just don't do one and then 10 months later do another, because no one's going to remember that you did the first one. So you have to have some sort of frequency and say, this is what it is, and have some sort of distribution network, whether promotion on, the thing that guy who spent $43 billion to burn down bought, or somewhere else on the other big meta, Book of Face, or through your own personal network. However you get the word out about your pod, do it that way and say, it's now a monthly, it's now a weekly. Again, it's up to you, and figure out where it fits in your schedule and your life, because it's the consistency that matters. The quality matters, but the consistency also matters, because if it isn't consistent, people will forget about it. So if you're going to do a season, hey, this is a season on incarceration in California. How do we deal with youth incarceration? Then another season of, this is how we deal with getting rid of, making sure people don't come back to jail. How do you reduce the recidivism rate? Do you have, essentially landing programs? How do people deal with this in libraries? How do people deal with this in partners in the community? Making sure that people don't go back into the prison industrial complex. So there's all sorts of ways you can do this.
Yeah, and I would say if you're going to do things like seasons, you want to plan it in enough that in the last episode of season 1, you say, and we'll be back in August with season 2, so that they have some idea that, okay, there's going to be a break here. We're coming back for this. You just make it really clear. I mean, it's like we all know from old days, oh, well, this TV season, this show is done in May. It will be back in September. I know that because it's just seasons. So, and
even in the interim time, you can put in highlights of interviews you did, or here's something that didn't make the show originally. It's really interesting during the in-between times, do all the background behind the scenes-y stuff. You're going to generate a lot of content. If you edit it, you're going to have content you don't want to necessarily put in the show, but maybe it's a full interview with someone who was in the juvenile justice system, got out, got assistance from other people, and now they're helping others. You may want to do a long interview of that as just a in-between time post for people, and say, just remember,
bonus
this
episodes.
This is a bonus episode just coming up. We're going to be back in a month with the next season of, the fantastic podcast about keeping yourself out of jail, or making sure that people who are in jail don't come back, whatever you want to name the podcast.
Let's quickly, before we move into a little bit more on the background of the technology of this stuff, is talking about that interview process. Julianne and Marty have both made it clear to us that there are plenty of people they can go to. But let me describe briefly what Maurice and I do to keep our flow of conversations going. We try to do a combination of conversations that feature the regular panelists on a theme that we determine ahead of time, and do those anywhere from 25 to 50% of the episodes. Then the other 50 to 75%, we look for people to interview. The theme is always about training, teaching, and learning in libraries. So we're trying to document what's going on there, what we're seeing, and what other people can replicate. It's sometimes as simple as Maurice coming across a reference to a book by somebody that has just written about training, teaching, learning. He'll send me a note saying, do you know the person? Or if not, can you contact them to see if we can get them on the show? And between the two of us, a lot of times we do have personal contacts with these people. And if we don't, we know how to reach them through their publishers or through other people that we know, or even sometimes using LinkedIn to see our mutual colleagues that will do that. On the extreme other side of it, I don't look at T is for Training as one little segment of my life and only deal with that for a certain time of the week, and then look at all the other things I'm doing. It gets integrated. And the extreme example is the Association for Talent Development, ATD, that Maurice may have mentioned earlier, I can't remember if we did this before the recording or during the recording, but Maurice came to one of the ATD conferences and interviewed an awful lot of people there. I started seeing the overlap between what we were doing and what those people were doing at the conference. The next year, when Maurice could not be at the conference, I was starting to go to sessions specifically looking for people that might be great interviewees for T is for Training. And Maurice will never forget, as I will never forget, that moment when I was running between sessions, had about 20 minutes. I called him on the spur of the moment and said, okay, here's a list of people I've met so far. You say yay or nay, and I'll see if I can invite them while I'm still here. We had this very quick conversation where I believe we lined up about 5 or 6 people for T is for Training on the strength of what I had seen in that 20-minute conversation.
It wasn't even yay or nay. You just said, here are some people. Here's what I want. Here's what I think they'd be great at. And you said, take it down. I literally am running between things I can't write. So why don't you write these things down so I can talk to you later, which he did, about these people. And that's how Paul ended up booking a good couple months of T is for Training that way, which is great. It also helps, as you all know, is to ping your personal network that you have already developed. You already know a bunch of people who are smart. I often say, and it's very true, I love having people on the podcast who are smarter than me because I become smarter because of their conversation and what they say. And that's really the key. You want people to leave your podcast a little bit smarter, a little better informed, able to do things they weren't able to do before they listen to your show.
And you want them so excited they want to come back for the next episode.
Well, yeah, that goes without saying. I mean, it's because you're great that they're going to come back. So,
Steve,
Yeah, no, I want to do the same thing, basically. Yeah, I want to have people who are smarter than me, particularly about this particular subject, that I don't know enough about, that I know
Right,
this
yep.
is the expert on this. So I try to always have smart people on. I mean, with the exception of when Maurice and Paul have been on. And then but other than those two guys, it's always smart people. But yeah, I mean, even obviously with Paul and Maurice, you got specialties and things. They like, I don't know about what you know about. So
Right.
not only do I get to learn, but I'm sharing it with everybody else so they get to learn about all of this. And at this point, it's nice that when you've been doing it for a while, people can kind of see that you've been doing it for a while, and there's a little bit of it makes it easier sometimes to book people, because I can say, well, I've been doing it since 2011, and there's a track record there,
Right.
and making these good connections that sometimes Paul will refer somebody to me, or somebody else will refer somebody to me. And so I'll get somebody just like that. It's not really difficult for me to find people to want to have on. I mean, number one, I've made good connections. So before I start that, Maurice and I have had an ongoing battle to make ALA recognize us as media for conferences. Let us in the media area. I don't think we've ever succeeded yet, but
Nope, not yet. Nope, I still haven't gotten a credential. They don't believe that podcasting is actual media. They believe we're just farting around, which is a pain in the butt. But that's okay. We're it's a hill we're going to keep climbing. Go ahead, Steve.
Well, I was going to say the good part of that is that message did not make its way to ALA Publishing, and they do consider me media. And so they will send me review copies of books.
Really? Okay, I need to hook up with your ALA publishing person. So let's talk about that.
And as long as I have them on the podcast, then I'm doing publicity for them. And so a lot of my guests are people who have written a book for ALA or Libraries Unlimited. I've had just authors on sometimes, and that's just because I happen to, I mean, the nice thing is the library world is filled with wonderful, nice people, accommodating people, that the vast majority of people that I just email or contact and say, hey, will you come on the show? They say, okay. So it is
you're not a goober. That's really what it is. You're proving you're not a goober. I think I forgot who asked the question about interviewing specifically. Julianne, I think that was you. Is that correct? That you want to know the questions beforehand?
Oh, yeah.
Always work that out with the person. If they're okay with seeding questions, as Paul mentioned in his emails, he'll say, these are a couple of questions that we'll probably ask. You can do it that way. You can do it with a Google Doc and say, what are some things you would like to talk about that I can tee up for you as a host? Or what are some things that you know you're going to talk about that have deep resources that I could put into the show notes, and just have that beforehand. It's really up to what you want to do and how you want to approach it. But if you're nervous about that, it's possible your guests are too, and say, here are 5 questions. It's a half of an hour show. Here are 5 questions I think are going to be good starting points. And then you play off of those answers. You may want to dive deep into something that, oh, you said this. Well, let's talk about that for a minute. Let's go a little deeper into that. That's your role as a host. And then as any type of facilitator, bring them back to those questions if they're important to you in the time that you have allotted for your show.
Yeah, I basically, I will offer that to the guest. I will say, I can share the questions with you in advance if you'd like. But I always try to also say that, you know, if the conversation leads somewhere else, we're going to go away from these questions. Like this
Right.
is after studying you and figuring out what I think that sort of in my mind, I get a shape of the interview. I kind of can see where things jump from subject to subject. It's like, but if we go off in some other way, we're going off on some other way. So this is where we're starting from, but that doesn't mean that this is the only thing we're going to ask.
Right.
It also doesn't mean that if I send you 10 questions, I'm going to ask you all 10 questions. It may be 7 questions and then 6 other ones that we think up, you know, because
Right.
I do try to, you asked about time too. It depends on the podcast. I mean, I try to keep mine under an hour, but I've listened to some podcasts that are 3 hours. I've listened to podcasts that are 15 minutes.
Right.
It's kind of depends on how deeply you want to go on that kind of thing.
And how well they keep your attention, because
Yeah.
a 15-minute podcast can feel like 3 hours. A 3-hour podcast can feel like 15 minutes. It all depends on how you keep the audio attention of the person. That's very important.
I
And that-
really like the approach that Steve's taking, where he says, here are some questions, but I'm not going to limit myself to those. And we're going to see where it goes.
Right.
I come from a strong journalism background, and we just did not give questions in advance saying, here are the only questions I'm going to ask, and we're not going to go anywhere else. That just doesn't work. And I carry that into podcasting. If I'm doing interviews, I will tell people, I'm not there to lay a trap for you. I'm not trying to play a gotcha moment on you, but I do want to pursue what I think our listeners are going to be interested in knowing. So if I ask you something that's not on that list, please don't be surprised. That's part of the game. You can answer or not answer. We'll keep it as cordial as possible. I think what makes that work is going into it with an underlying sense of trust. If your subject trusts you to be there to help them get their message across, whether you agree with it or not, and if they trust you to ask the right questions to help them get that there, then the list becomes less important. I'm not totally averse to giving a list of questions. I think for some people that's helpful, but I rarely do that. And the result is the interviews I do, both not necessarily in a podcasting setting, but something very close to that, like the project that Tool and I have been talking about so much here. People know what the subject's going to be, and we will run with it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mind sharing the questions in advance, but my wariness about it comes a little bit from that you get a little more spontaneity when it's not, when you haven't read them all in advance. But I understand, I mean, I definitely understand wanting to know in advance kind of some idea of what's going to get asked. But the problem, I think sometimes it's rare, very rare, but there will be people who will read their answers.
Yeah.
So I gave it to them.
Want that at all, ever.
Yes, and you can hear that on the podcast sometimes. I try to cut it out, but sometimes you can do it, and you can hear the paper move as they turn the page, and it's like I mean, they're not doing a good job reading it even. I mean, it's just like they're definitely reading the answer. That's usually, no offense to the ALA presidential candidates, that's usually who does that, because I think they're very specifically trying to target a message.
Absolutely.
But with those people, I mean, those people in particular, because I'm trying to get something out of them, I do keep a couple of questions off to the side that I don't tell them about that I'm going to throw out there just to make sure that they talk about a topic that they don't want to talk about.
And if you want to do that sort of long form thing, I'm going to brag about myself. I got interviewed by a publication information today in that format, which was question and answers in a Google Doc. And that in and of itself is a different document. That could be the basis of your podcast. That could be the extra from your podcast, but that isn't a podcast. Someone reading that stuff isn't a podcast. A podcast is more of a form conversation arena, whether it's really really formatted, as in we're doing topic A, topic B, topic C, or very off the cuff. It's a serialized, essentially electronic audio magazine. And an excellent question in chat, Aaron. It's important to ask the potential guests, if there are any questions that might be off of, then I can't read the rest because I'm in a
Off
different
the,
format. of
off the
Zoom.
table, specifically referring to
Off the
guests that
table.
might be formerly incarcerated or differently able.
Right. Absolutely. There's some stuff that what don't you want to talk about, I think is important to know, even more so than what to talk about.
So to summarize what we've got here.
Sorry, real quick on that though. I don't usually ask that in advance, but I do. If somebody says, well, I don't have anything to say about that, or I don't really want to talk about that, I will just, the way my show is, I will just edit that out. So
right. But
like if they say I'm not comfortable with that, I'll say, okay, cool.
Right. You since you edit your show, Steve, you can do that. I'm live, and it truly is I do not edit my shows. I have a pre-show we talk, I have a post-show we talk that's not recorded, but the actual show itself is recorded live. So it's old school, and I mean old school live television. It's live as it happens. So I have to know that stuff in order not to have that awkward silence of, yeah, I ain't talking about that. So I really hated that you actually forced me to answer that question. You're an idiot. I will never be on this show, flip a table and leave. So I want to prevent that.
So similar to what we're hearing here, as you move into the interview phase here, for Marty and Julianne, they've got an audience that can keep them going for months, if not a couple of years, in terms of interviewees. And what you're hearing from Steve and from Maurice and from me is that when we look at interview subjects, we go as broad as we can. We use every experience we have. We look for people that we find interesting and think others would find interesting. And that's sort of the litmus test up front. If that person says something that interested us, and that is the same interest that our audience has, we know that that's somebody we want to pursue. In terms of reaching out to them, if you're really shy, get somebody that can do the reach out for you. But if you're not shy, send a note. Oftentimes, the people you think are going to be most inaccessible are happy to have a forum. And it doesn't matter whether you tell them I've got 10 or 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 listeners. They just appreciate knowing that they've got the forum and somebody's going to give them a shot to get their message out. So that deals with that. Now, we've talked a little bit about platforms and technology. Steve and Maurice, as briefly as possible, can you lay out what you think podcasters should think about in terms of equipment they have that they can already use to make this easy, and then what they do to upgrade?
You already have a phone that has, odds are you have some sort of smartphone, whether it's the Android family or the iPhone family, that has a smart recorder thing that you can connect to a computer somewhere or send to yourself that can produce an MP3 document, which is an audio file. As Steve said, having an audio file is the key to having a podcast. That is, your podcast is your audio file. So you already have tools that you have. You can then, if you like it, if you want to do it, spend money on some device to record people live, to spend money on a decent camera, a decent microphone, etc. as you get into it. But to start, really all you need is something. There's a service called freeconferencecall.com. You could host a free conference call and get the audio of that conference call, put it up on your website, that MP3 file, and that's your podcast. It's not necessarily distributed anywhere. You don't have an RSS feed, but that's a start. You can say it's hosted here. And some libraries do that. They have enough traffic. They drive to their own site. They don't need to share it via some sort of subscription process, RSS feed, which is a really simple syndication feed that most podcast hosting platforms will do for you. They'll put out all the links, etc. That's why I'm lazy and won't leave TalkShoe, because it automatically pumps my stuff out everywhere. So find yourself a place that pumps your stuff out everywhere, that makes you happy, and that you can do it cheap, inexpensively, not too much money, some money. The microphone, the Yeti that I believe Steve and I both use, is $99 or something, $89 you can get on the from anywhere.
Yeah, I think it's usually about 150 or something, but regularly on sale, 99.
Right, it's usually on sale for $99. And all Yeti microphones are pretty decent for what you do in podcasting. They all can connect right into your computer seamlessly into a program like Audacity or something you want to pay for, like GarageBand, etc., that you may already have. Having a computer helps. That's sort of the hardware. The software are your connections, and that's really what you really have to cultivate, are your connections, your people. Your network is your software, and that you are, as someone said in my podcast, you're as rich as the size of your network. So you really develop your network of friends, of people you want on the show, people who recommend your show, people who are panelists, people who say, oh, I know this really cool person. I don't have time, or I don't want to interview him, but maybe you do. You know, develop that network. That's another very important thing that some of you obviously already have and just need to cultivate for this particular purpose.
Well, and then you also just what we're doing here, Zoom, I mean, is
Yeah.
if you're doing under 40 minutes, it's free to use Zoom and
Yep.
record things. So just keep it under 40 minutes and you're cool. You can have as many people on as you want.
Right. And then you could
Longer
also,
than that, you got to pay them, I think. But
and then you also edit. You could have one 40-minute session for one thing and another 40-minute session for something, edit them together. Maybe you get a good hour, and that's your podcast.
Yeah.
And be flexible here. You know, what we just recently on an episode of T is for Training, we had 2 people come in that we were very excited about interviewing. Talk Show was not cooperating that night. We didn't want to cancel. So we just switched the whole thing over to Zoom and it worked perfectly. Yep. Being that flexible in your podcasting makes life better for you and for the people you work with, less headaches.
Yeah, and then Maurice was talking about TalkShoe takes care of a lot of the RSS stuff for circulating ideas, since it's Internet Archive and it's kind of crazy, put together weird with sticks and glue and duct tape. I have to, it works, but I think it ends up being some other feed, a couple of feeds on top of each other, but it works. For the ones in my library, we do it a little more professionally because there's money from an organization paying for it. We use Podbean, which is a host, and basically they do the kind of the same thing where they send it, like whenever we publish an episode, they're the ones pushing it out to Apple and Google. And we did have to, that is one thing, if you want it on Spotify, you have to specially go and like register with them and stuff. Like they won't just pick up an RSS feed. You got to do stuff with them. You got to do stuff for them. I think Amazon maybe too, you have to do stuff with, but regardless. So if you want to be on those, I mean, and Spotify is growing and podcasting. Right. So
and Apple Podcasts are weird. I've done my show for a while, and I cannot get my head around trying to edit any description on Apple Podcasts. I just it's so hard still to do. So that's that.
Yeah, a lot of the stuff. It's funny that, you know, I set it up 11 years ago and I don't remember anymore.
One lost weekend, right, Steve? 11-year lost weekend.
Yeah, and one nice thing about it is that we don't do it often because we kind of have our own equipment and stuff. But at libraries, if you have some kind of makerspace or whatever like that, use that equipment to do your podcast.
Absolutely.
Because they're the one. I mean, you probably have like really nice, fancy schmancy equipment in there. Just use that to record your podcast. And
there's some spaces that have, I know there's one space in Maryland that has a couple that have podcasting studios. That's literally what they are designed to do. Use those resources. Find the libraries that have that resource and use them. There are usually public libraries or academic libraries or special libraries that might have the resource wherever you are. Use those resources. And that's how you also create friends. Hey, what are you doing? I'm doing a podcast about this. That's really cool. I have someone you might want to talk to about this. Really? Who are they? Here's their information. Great. We can bring them on the show. Awesome.
Marty, do you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to say in every state, there is a Talking Books library, a Talking Books and Braille library, and they have wonderful recording studios. And a lot of them have lost some of their volunteers and may have more availability than they would have before. So
excellent point, Marty. Thank you. That is true. Don't be afraid to reach out in general and specific to your state library agency person, librarian, etc. If they can't help you, they usually know what's going on. If you have some sort of not niche, that's the wrong word, maybe not quite as popular topic, they will know who's doing something around that topic in that state and can usually point you in the direction of that person.
So for the final segment of this, let's do some quick workshopping. If Marty and Julianne are game to do this, you both at the beginning of our conversation laid out potential podcasts that sounded well worth pursuing. Let's use those as case studies. What I've done in chat is put in 9 questions that we think are really good things to ask yourself before you start a short or long-term series of podcasts. For those people that are watching the archive version, what I'm going to do up front is just read the questions quickly so you know they're here. By reading them into the show, you can always stop this later and go back and transcribe them for yourself. So if I were answering 9 questions myself to get started, it would start with, what change are you attempting to foster? I'd follow that up with, how would you describe your dream audience or group of fellow advocates? I'd follow that up with, what would attract them to your podcast in terms of content, format, and length of podcast. We've talked about the different lengths here. Maurice and Steve have had plenty to say about that. Fourth question would be, what platform or platforms might you use to record and archive your podcast to reach the largest possible audience? You heard Steve and Maurice talk about TalkShoe and about the Internet Archive and a bunch of other things that are out there. What tools are already in place for you to use in producing your podcast? Sixth question is, what tools do you need to acquire? Again, you don't need to spend a lot of money here. Maurice made that point that you've got a lot of stuff in your pocket you could use to get started. Seventh is, who is your core group of podcast regulars, including recurring panelists, producers, editors, publicists? That is your community. That keeps your podcast going. It makes you not be the one that loses all their hair. Although if you're looking at the video here, you can see what podcasting has done to the three of us. Eighth one would be, what topics can you address in your first 4 podcasts so you get a sense of flow? Create a sense of narrative that goes from episode to episode and see where that takes you. And finally, what would you need to make the podcast sustainable? So let's play this game with Julianne and Marty, going for one-line sentences. And if you want, jot down your answer so that you walk away from this with a plan of action. First thing is, what change are you attempting to foster as an advocate through your podcast? Either one of you.
Paul, I don't see them in the chat, the questions. Did you put
Okay.
them?
You put them in the Google Doc, Paul.
Oh my God, did I do that?
We did.
You know, I put them, but maybe I actually, okay, tech problem. I put,
No, hold on.
I cut and pasted them in, and then I forgot to hit return.
Okay, all right.
Folks,
Oh,
at
there we
home,
are.
don't make
All
that
right.
mistake yourself. If you've got your podcast going, hit the record button before you start talking. If you've got questions for your audience, make sure you hit return and then everybody can see them. But I'm just going to go through it. They're there for you to see. But the first one is, one line answer as quickly as you can. What change are you attempting to foster with your proposed podcast?
Inclusion. Maybe just one word. I want people with disabilities to be part of the communities who use their libraries, and their libraries need to work for them.
And beautiful for anybody watching this, or those of you that are in this session right now. If you've got that written down, every time you're starting to do a new podcast, you just say, what am I doing? Inclusion. Does this proposed podcast fit that? Yes or no? If it doesn't, ask yourself either, am I going to pursue that or should I dump it? And if I am going to do it, do I need to rewrite my mission statement? That in essence is what we're doing. Julianne, one-line statement or the words that come to mind for what change you are attempting to foster.
I think, I wish I just had one word, but I don't. So I guess I would say, well, one word, be 2 words, raise awareness, and then creating the potential, raise awareness and about the youth, and also about the potential for partnerships.
So if you write that down now, you've already got your publicity statement, your mission statement that goes on your podcast site that says, this is a show about raising awareness, and follow the rest of the language you use there. And if you're not writing it down fast enough, remember Karen's going to post this on the YouTube channel that CLA has, so you can go back later and watch the recording and jot it down. The beauty of podcasting, the beauty of recordings, we don't lose what's said as long as we're putting it out there and making it accessible to people. Marty, how would you describe your dream audience or group of fellow advocates?
Both library workers who already work with people with disabilities and those who are interested in working with them, and people from the disability community who value libraries.
Fantastic. Julianne?
I would say, yeah, libraries, people who work in libraries, and then also people in the community who are working with the youth and the youth themselves. So it's 2 parts. And my goal is to bring those 2 parts together.
So if you are a person watching the archived version of this and that resonates with you, or what Marty said resonates with you, contact them. They're not that hard to find online. Tell them you like this idea. Ask what you can do to support them. That's how Maurice developed the T is for Training community. That's how Steve develops his ongoing group. Third question there, what would attract these people to your podcast in terms of content, format, or length of podcast? Let's go to Julianne to start here so that we don't keep putting Marty first on all these.
I like Marty first.
Tricked you. You don't get that option. Bad host.
Welcome to podcast, live podcasting, Julianne.
What would attract them in terms of content format and length of podcast? I would say what would attract them is for the librarians would be the social justice aspect and and learning about work that they could do, that they might want to be doing, or had thought about doing, or had never thought about doing. And for the people who are in the field, realizing that libraries make great partners.
And when you go back later, after reviewing the archive version of this, you copy that down. That's the second or third line in your description of your show and in all the publicity materials to reach your audience. Marty, same question for you.
I think shorter is better. Not, I can't imagine a 3-hour podcast that somebody said before. So shorter is better and truly accessible. It really needs to be accessible for people with all kinds of disabilities, whether it be vision or hearing or, trouble using their hands.
And there you have it. You put this in your written materials. This is a podcast that is accessible for all people. It's exactly the way you just said it, and you've got your first draft for it. Let's skip ahead a little bit because we are getting short on time here, and you can always go back and fill in the gaps. But another really important thing that is encouraging is what tools are already in place for you to use in producing your podcast. Julianne?
What tools are in place? Sorry.
Yeah, what do you have already that you don't need to go out and purchase that you can use to produce a podcast?
Oh, I see. You mean the physical tools? Yeah. Yeah, I have a little mini recorder like Maurice has, and I also have a computer and a smartphone and a headset with a like Marty's wearing. And I don't know, what else do I need? I don't know.
Well, that's another part of the exercise that comes down the road. But asking that question is to say you're not starting from scratch.
Right.
And anybody watching the archive version, you're not starting from scratch unless you're living on a desert island, you don't have Wi-Fi or electricity. You probably have something or know somebody who has something. Marty, what do you have in place already?
Just what Julie has. I have a really good smartphone. I have a good computer. I have this headset. Sounds like that may be enough to get started.
Yep. Let's jump to the penultimate question out of the 9. What topics could you address in your first 4 podcasts? Marty?
Yikes. Julie
That's just
first.
a good one.
No, it's your turn.
Oh man. Who are the people in a community? And invite people to introduce themselves, people who are library users, people who want to use libraries. So who is in your community? What does it mean to make sure that they feel welcomed and included? I think some focused things then more typically, people with vision impairments, but I have a particular interest in making sure that people who are deaf are there. So what would make you want to go to the library? What kinds of programs would you enjoy?
What kind of systems have to be in place from a library point of view? For example, do you have someone who can speak American Sign Language on your staff? Is that something that you want? Do you close caption all of your things? Or do you make just your graphics on your website have alternate text? Just those little things that people can do. Wow, you got a lot for your first 4 podcasts, Marty. And I'm not even getting to Julianne. I'm already thinking like 50 episodes for Julianne's podcast. So there's a lot of shall we say tofu on that bone. So there's a lot to work with there for both of your ideas, because you both have the network, you have Rich and you have the interest. You already have the 90%. So don't be scared, just do it. If it doesn't work out for you, that's okay, but you tried, and maybe what you did was connect some people together that maybe do another successful project. You bring people together, maybe your specific thing doesn't work, but they get together and do something that they never would have if they didn't meet each other through your podcast. Be that node for people.
I love that, actually. I would love to see people do better than I could ever do.
Exactly. That's what you want.
Yeah.
I want people say, well, would you care if someone started a podcast? Oh God, it's no. I'll help you. You do what makes the world better. That's what everyone should want to do. And it's what we are ostensibly like to do in libraries. We want to make our communities better. So we work in libraries. We make our communities better. It's kind of what we do. That's kind of our jam.
Julianne, let's jump to the last question and just a one-off here. What would you need to make your podcast sustainable?
I don't get to answer the question. What topics could you address in your first 4 podcasts?
No, you were getting too comfortable there. I'm going to give you a different question.
Wait a minute.
You see what's going on here, especially if you're
I
watching the archive
do.
version.
I
What keeps
totally
this lively is just when your interview subjects think that they can stop listening to what the other person is saying and formulate their answer, you want to change it up because we all laugh together. We're not making fun of each other. We're laughing together. And it draws us into being a community that is innovative and responsive in the moment. And that's what makes Maurice and Steve's podcast so exciting. You don't know what's going to happen next. You want to wait. There's a sense of excitement. So Julianne, you're totally unprepared. What would you need to make the podcast sustainable?
I get sustainable as in continuing. Is that what?
Yes.
Okay. I would need to continue to make connections in the communities that I'm talking about, both the library community and the youth serving community. I would need to, and I'm actually really good at that. I'm really good at making connections. And I love what you were talking about earlier, the idea of being a catalyst, Maurice. I just feel like that's the most important thing that I would like to do is just be a catalyst. I'm fine with bringing people together and then moving back and saying, okay, I'm so glad you got to meet. I'm so, and just moving back. It's sort of like the Montessori approach to life.
I call it the dinner party.
Yeah.
The best dinner party is where your guests talk to each other and I get to go in the kitchen. And
right.
They're talking to each other, they're entertaining each other, they're meeting who never would have met without you, and they're having a good time and they're doing stuff without you. And I'm so okay with that.
Yeah, me too. Yeah.
For me, that's a successful party.
Yeah.
When people who don't know each other that know you, they then know each other. And then they have whatever successful relationship in their model is successful.
Yeah.
I always say the less of me on the podcast, the better.
Absolutely.
For both of you there, you've just made a really important point, and it takes us back to something Maurice and I have been talking about a lot through T's for Training, Priya Parker's book on what makes meetings work, the whole gathering thing. You don't just go in the kitchen and let everybody do stuff. You are a presence, whether you are right there in the living room or in the kitchen, but everybody knows you're there. And if you sense that anything's off, your role as a facilitator to keep that thing flowing is to drop in the wisecrack or drop in the next question. Or as happened when Maurice and I were doing an interview in a different situation. I asked him a question that totally bombed. Turned out I was thinking of somebody else and he made a very funny comment. We were recording this and I knew we were recording it. So I looked at him, stopped listening to what he was saying, and said, just a minute, I need to reset because that question obviously bombed and we need to get ourselves back on track. That spontaneity and that willingness to say, all right, folks, that wasn't funny or that didn't work, but we're going to pick ourselves up and go on. Nobody's going to remember that unless it goes viral on YouTube, in which case you just like grow a head of hair and then pull it out again to make up for it. But what we're hearing here today is these podcasts thrive because they create a sense of community. As advocates, what you want to do is bring people together, get them excited, draw off that commonality that you have there, sustain that as long as you can. And as either Steve or Maurice said, it doesn't have to be forever. Either you solve the issue and you move on to something else, or you realize you can't solve it and you move on to something else. But the beauty is you're creating something wonderful and sustainable in the moment that was well worth being part of. And if this session, this workshop that turned into a pseudo podcast is an example of anything, it's an example of get the right people in the right room and magic can happen. Stephen, Maurice, final words.
Well, I would just say that I think the biggest thing that you need for sustainability is for you to be passionate about the subject that you are podcasting about. Because if you're just doing it because you feel like, well, I don't know, I guess somebody should do that, and you're just you really have to be passionate about it, especially if you're going to make it an ongoing thing.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, Maurice and I are passionate about our things because mine's been going 11 years and yours is what, 14, 15, something like that?
2008, so 14 years.
Yeah, so you got to have some passion behind it to keep doing it that long.
And it's okay if you don't really feel like doing it one time. It's really okay. You can either slog through it or take a brief break. That's okay too. If you feel it's too much for you, practice self-care and say, I don't have time to do this. It's why, Julianne, for you, I said, you're asking what's the right time. Well, if it's too much to do it once a month, then you do it quarterly or you do it every other month. It depends on you. If you want to be the center and the host and the catalyst of this change, it depends on your schedule, your time, the way you feel. Make it comfortable for you, make it easier on yourself, and you can keep doing it or not do it. That's up to you. It's okay, again, to say, okay, we're good. One season's good. I've had what I had to say. I connected who I needed to connect.
Maurice?
Can I just ask a
Oh,
question?
go ahead, Julianne.
I have two questions, actually. One is, and I know you're trying to tie it all up and end, but do you have more than one person sometimes on a podcast? That's my first question. And
Oh
second,
God, yes.
okay. And second, Maurice, when you said you're live, what does that mean?
That means I set up every other Thursday, usually at 9 p.m. Eastern time. There's a link to a particular place that it's the T is for Trading party zone, as it were. It's an open door. People can come in. It takes just either a phone call or a headset call to participate. And I'm just there at all times. It's having a regularly scheduled room to do this. And we have topics around things that sometimes we don't, but it's always a regularly scheduled room that's easily accessible to anyone who can connect to a computer or a phone.
Okay,
And that's the key for me. And I just do it every single time. Now, do I do episodes where I'm doing interviews not during that time? Yes. And then I put them up on the thing, but that's my normal way. I started the podcast because I wanted to recreate what happened at conferences, where the informal learning, which is the important stuff, happens not inside the sessions, but outside the sessions where you make those personal connections. I wanted a place that could happen every 2 weeks. It turned out to be every 2 weeks. So I wanted a place that could happen. It turns out every 2 weeks works. And that's what I do. Steve is more of an interview thing. What was the name of the podcast that inspired you, Steve?
There was one that, well, I mean, fresh air from the NPR world, but yeah, I mean,
and Steve is more of an individual interview podcast. So it depends on what you want to do. I'm a panel discussion, but it can turn into an individual interview. A lot of the author things do that. We focus on an author, for example, what Paul was talking about. We have the two authors of a book on. You talk about the book and they are the main subjects. But other people can chime in with questions. We can tangent. We can bring it all back to the book, etc. It all depends on what you want to do and how your topic is best served.
And Julie, it sounds like yours would be good of telling stories. And so that may end up being, you might even write stuff out and do it more scripted for parts of it before, in between interview stuff. So there's all kinds of stuff you can do.
Yeah. Or you have a panel of people who are doing stuff around the country and they can talk to each other about doing it in different jurisdictions, et cetera. What is it like to prevent recidivism in Maryland, prevent recidivism in Texas, prevent recidivism in California, and how do libraries there help them or not help them? And what would they like to have happen with that?
Maurice, do your usual spiel. Where can people find T is for Training online?
You can find T is for Training on the World Wide Web at tisfortraining.wordpress.com, on the the bird engine at T is FOR Training are the two best places to find it. And you can find me at ColemanAssociates.net, and that has a link also to the podcast page. Again, tisfortraining.wordpress.com.
And if you want to join the live sessions, you go to talkshoe.com and look up T is for Training, and there are links to each episode. Steve, where do people find you?
Circulatingideas.com for the main site there, or of course, subscribe in your podcast app of choice. And then for my work podcasts, they're actually all under one feed for the library. If you just search for Gwinnett County Public Library, that's where all of the podcasts from my library reside there.
Okay, folks, we're at almost the end of our time. Maurice, Steve, any last minute words you want to offer to activists thinking about incorporating podcasts into their toolkits?
Do it.
Nice. Top that, Maurice.
I won't.
All right, then. Any last minute words?
Good luck. do the good work, fight the good fight, tell your story and the story of the people that you have on the show, on your show. You want them, provide a place for them to tell their story.
Thank you.
As soon as I finish this final wrap, Karen, you can stop the recording. And then those of you that want to stay for a few more minutes for the after show party, we'll have a final wrap up here. But thank you all and hope that you'll come back to us next month. We always do these on the second Tuesday of the month, 10 o'clock start time, Pacific time. Hope you'll come back and hope you visit the archives to see what we've already done. Thank you very much for being part of this.
Right, thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks. Steve, I
Thank you.
just subscribed to Circulating.